As we begin, I want to ask this question, or a series of questions rather. But what is faith? Have you ever really considered that? We use the word all the time. Faith is a regular part of our Christian vocabulary, and it is a central element to Christianity. But have you ever really stopped and thought about it? What makes faith faith? And what is not faith? Sometimes it's helpful to consider what is the opposite, what it's not, to help us get a picture of what it is. Is faith just wishful thinking? Maybe I'll get a new car if I'm really nice to my dad. Is it just playing the odds? If I buy this $3 lottery ticket, maybe I'll be a millionaire. Is it plunging ahead into uncharted territories? I've never tried this before, but let's just give it a whirl and see what happens. Is that faith? Is it just blind acceptance? That really makes no sense, but someone told me it's true, so it must be. Is that what faith is? Or is it something more reasonable, something more certain? Despite the unknowns that just inherently accompany faith, is there not something we can stand upon or hold firm to? And as we continue now in chapter 4, we're going to see these illustrations of what saving faith is. And Paul is going to use this Old Testament example of Father Abraham, whom we looked at last week and whom we just heard read. Remember now, the first part of chapter 4 is connected to the final conclusions at the end of chapter 3. Remember those questions that begin in 3:27, where then is boasting? And those three conclusions that Paul made there are that Abraham is faith, he has no room to boast, and circumcision and faith, and this is the plan that God has made and has always been in place, that those things are now illustrated in chapter 4. And so tonight, in these first few verses, we're going to see the illustration of the third conclusion, then the role of the law being established then in its rightful role, that being to convict of sin and not to save or justify men. And then the chapter will close with an illustration, with showing the nature of faith, the aspects of faith, answering the question, well, what is faith? Illustrated in Abraham's life. And so this chapter here, as we survey the landscape of all of Romans, we ask the question, well, what is Romans 4 here for? Why does Paul include this? Well, one, we know it's to illustrate, and it's meant to really teach us, but also to encourage us in the faith. It's to encourage these believers that Paul is writing to in Rome that are in the faith. That their faith, this is something that has been for generation after generation, all the way back to Father Abraham. And so that is my aim tonight. For those of you in the faith, I hope that this is an encouragement to you. I hope it not only teaches you about what is faith and teaches you about the Old Testament evidence of justification by faith alone, but for those of us in the faith tonight, I hope that this is an encouragement to you. I hope that this is an increase to your faith. And if you are not yet in the faith, and you are here, you are listening or watching this, then I would plead with you. I would plead with you to turn from your sin and cast yourself upon Christ. Because without that, all of this stuff will mean nothing. So let's carry on. Look then at verse 13, where we left off and where we're going here. As I said, it's connected to chapter 3, verse 31. And the law is here to we are to establish the law. We're to uphold it, not to make it obsolete or useless. And so in verse 13 now, Paul turns back to this final conclusion and attempts to illustrate it in these 3 verses. He says, "For the promise to Abraham or to his descendants that he would be heir of the world was what? Was not through the law. And Paul's already done a really good job at illustrating that and making the case that our salvation, that our inheritance does not come through the law, but what does it come through? Through the righteousness of faith. The righteousness that comes through faith. Remember that there was a misunderstanding that the Jews had placed on the law. It was never meant to save, though they had elevated it to this. But the law was never meant to be a means of anybody's justification. The more and the better that you adhere to the law, the better that you bring your holiness to God the Father. And it was never meant to that. It has always been, justification has always been through faith. We are made righteous by faith. And so in these verses here now, he's going to show how this was even illustrated through Abraham's life. Because if we think about Father Abraham, he keeps going back to him. What came first, Abraham or the law? Abraham, right? Abraham, Genesis, comes on the scene at the end of Genesis chapter 11, and then really in 12 through 23-ish, 24, those 12 chapters are devoted to Abraham's life. And the law comes when? The law doesn't come until Exodus, which is after. And so God's promise to Abraham and his descendants that they would be justified by faith, that Abraham had faith, and that was credited to him as righteousness, came before the law. And so then the question is asked, well, when the law came on the scene, did that make the justification by faith alone obsolete? Did it annul the law for Abraham and his descendants several hundred years afterwards when the law comes on the scene? No. It didn't then, and it still is not. It has always been by faith. If the Jews want justification by obedience to the law, then it would cancel out God's promises, wouldn't it? If the law was meant to save, if that was the role of the law, then faith would be made obsolete. We would not need to have faith because the law would then usurp it. Calvin said that if that mindset, if they want the law over faith, then that would render faith inoperative. But as heirs of Abraham, we don't forget all of God's promises of righteousness. And so really these three verses here is really just the illustration now of the law's rightful role. And verse 15 then comes back to that, doesn't it? For the law brings about what? Brings about wrath. The law brings about wrath. We know that it's meant to convict us of sin. We are guilty of committing and deserve punishment for our sin. We deserve the wrath of God, and that was the design of the law, to come and be an aid to teach us how to live rightly and to convict us and bring us back on the straight and narrow when we get off the tracks. But if there's no laws to break, then no tickets to give, right? So the question could be asked, well, then why? God, why do you even have the law? Why didn't you just, if it's only meant to convict of sin, then why didn't you just get rid of it? Because where there's no law, there's no violation. And could you imagine what I-10 would be like if there was no speed limit? It would be chaos. It's already chaos, and there's rules to follow. But if we were all left to ourselves, the very things that Paul has already argued to, that if we, even without the law, we are guilty. Because our Spirit bears witness with us, and it is just better this way. God's plan of grace is better. It is better for us now that we have been justified, because there is no taking that away. There is no removing of that declaration. And yet, without the law before that, even we are better off now than when Adam and Eve were. Because there was even the potential for sin. Now there's no potential for our righteousness to be removed. Once we are found, then we are kept in Christ. We are sealed. And so our status, our identity now as being declared righteous is better. God's plan of righteousness, of showing this by grace, of his richness of mercy, of his love, of his pardoning sin and imputing to us Christ's righteousness is much, much better. It's much better. The law and faith here in chapter 13, or verses 13 and 15 now has just been illustrated of this relationship. The law meant to convict of sin. Faith meant to justify. Right? So in verse 16 now, he gives us this reason. Well, let me just back up here. In case all of that just didn't make sense, or we just kind of worked through it. Really, to summarize 13 to 15 now, is Paul makes a statement in verse 13. But basically it says, our inheritance of righteousness comes through faith, not the law, for Abraham and all of his biological and spiritual descendants. That's the plan. Reason number one, well, if it's through the law, then the promises of faith are nullified. And reason number two in verse 15 is that why? Because the law brings about wrath and not righteousness. Okay? The law brings wrath and not righteousness. And so that's really the summary. And so now the question comes as we get to verse 16. So then what is faith? Where does faith play into this? And so Paul's just illustrated all of these points. He's just shown that it's not through circumcision in the previous verses, and now tonight it's not through the law. We know in all of this illustrated in Abraham's life. So then what is faith? And verse 16 is now the transition to illustrate the nature of saving faith in Abraham's life. It wasn't through the law, it wasn't through any ritual, it wasn't through any of these things. Because here's the promise that God made to him, despite him, and in all of his circumstances. And so for this reason, if it's not the law, then what? Well, look here. For this reason, it is by, verse 16, by faith, in order that it may be in accordance with grace. And so really a long way to say it is by faith through grace, right? Or you might say it in other words, by grace through faith. That's how it's said in another way. For this reason, it is by faith through grace, so that the promise will be what? Guaranteed to all his descendants. Not only of those who are of the law, so not only to those who are Jews and who are his biological descendants, but also to those who are his spiritual descendants, those who have the same faith. This promise is sure to all of us. This promise is sure to all descendants, not just Jews who are given the law, but also to all those who believe. The promise that justification is by grace through faith, and this is how we are declared right with God, not by obeying the law. And really, you think, well, how else could we be certain of our salvation? How else could we be certain of this declaration? How else could we be certain that the judge's word is true? Because if it is on my adherence, if it is based on my obedience to the law, well, that's not sure. I mean, if your life is like mine, isn't it kind of a roller coaster day to day? Aren't we being conformed to the image? We haven't arrived at perfection. And so if my righteous standing is based on how well I obey, I'm cooked. If it is based on me, then how could I ever be certain? How could I ever be sure? How could I ever walk confidently if it is based on me and my output of holiness? But rather, if it is based on God's input of Christ's righteousness in my life, in that standing, that his wrath has been satisfied, and my need for salvation has been satisfied. Now that is something more sure. Look here at verse 17. Because he's going to refer to the Old Testament promise of descendants. As it has been written, Father of many nations have I made you. So referring back, but this is why Abraham was so certain. Not in our adherence to the law, not based on our output of obedience, but rather, why was he so certain? In the presence of him whom he believed, even God, why? Who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. This is the basis. This is why he could be so certain. Literally, we think about this as to giving life to the dead. We see this in Abraham's life, his measure of his faith in Isaac. All right? When God calls Abraham to take Isaac up the mountain. And we learn from Hebrews that he believed that, you know what, God has called me to do this, and that even if I do go through with the sacrifice, that God is able to bring life to the dead. And God was sure of that. But also, even just the fact that Isaac was born in their old age. That he was able to give life where it did not exist. He was able to call into being this child Isaac from a dead womb. Abraham knowing the creation account, that even the whole very world was called into being ex nihilo, out of nothing. That God just spoke and it happened. And if he could create the whole world, surely he can create a child in an old barren womb. This was why he was so certain. Because literally he had seen these, he had experienced these things. This is why he believed the basis of it. But there's also some spiritual implications here. Because don't these things speak to the nature of what we believe? That God, through the Holy Spirit, regenerates our dead self. He gives life to the dead. Those of us who are dead in our transgressions and sins. He regenerates our dead self. And he gives faith. He brings faith where it did not exist, where we could not conjure it up in our own self. And so not only does he regenerate us, but he also gives us faith where we did not have our own. The nature of our faith. Be certain, beloved, tonight. Rest assured in your faith. And at this point, I just want us to pause for a moment, because we're going to continue on and we're going to look at the aspects of faith in the coming verses here. But as we get into this, I want us to just pause for a second and take stock of Abraham's life. Most of us are familiar with his life, and so I'm not going to belabor and give you the whole biography of his life. You can read Genesis for that. But I want us to just pause for a moment and consider this. Because Abraham's very name meant what? It means what? It meant father of many, right? As Abram. And then he's renamed, and he's called the father of a multitude. And he's given that, well, he has that name growing all through, and then eventually he becomes renamed and stuff. But just think about this. Going his whole life, he lives 175 years. But God first makes the promise to him in chapter 12, and Abraham's around the age of 60. And he has this name, father of many. But how many children does he have at that point? 0. I mean, if there was ever a name incongruent with its meaning and the reality of somebody's life, it was Abraham. And we also know from Abraham's name that from Abraham's life, that he was a wealthy man, that he had a lot of land and a lot of livestock and many slaves, that he was hospitable. And he owned and controlled a lot of these wells in Israel. And so as a nomadic society and people traveling, shepherds coming and moving through, Abraham would have multiple occasions to be hospitable and to bring people into his tents. And just picture a discourse, somebody coming in, hey, hi, my name is Abraham. Well, that means father of many. How many children do you have? 0. Imagine the murmuring, imagine the ridicule. Imagine every guest coming in. For decades, this continues too. Knowing that this is the promise of God, that God has even said, you will have many descendants, that your name is not necessarily incongruent with your reality, but you're going to have to wait decades for it to become true. And so each time with each guest coming in, pouring salt on the wound, rubbing it in. Oh, I'm Abraham. That means father of many. Introduce me to your children. I don't have any. What? This guy. Imagine the ridicule. Imagine the testing of his resolve. Imagine the faith of this man for decades, year after year, bringing people in, introducing himself, telling his name, telling of the promise of God, and yet the reality of his life is he has 0 kids. And for decades, this continues. Each year becoming more unlikely that he will even have children. The older he gets, the more impossible his name becoming a reality becomes. older he gets, watching the sparks of intimacy between him and Sarah dwindle, watching their bodies decay, the older that they get, just the reality of time weighing in on him. And every so often, over these 40 years until Isaac is actually born, God speaks into this and reiterates his promise just every so often. Each time becoming really more specific in the promise, yet each time more and more unlikely. Each time more and more impossible. Each time hope for change diminishes. This is the circumstances of this man for decades of his life. And some of us may be walking in similar circumstances. Some of us may be married to an unbelieving spouse. Some of you may be to an unbelieving spouse for decades. And you know the promise that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. You know God hears your prayers. You plead every morning for your spouse, and yet nothing. And you're getting up there in years, and you've been married to this man or to this woman for decades. And the older that he or she gets, the more set in their ways they become, and the more unlikely their salvation becomes. God reminds you yet again and again as you plead with him, as you devour his word. But so far, no results. Others of you maybe have a child who's rejected both the family and the faith. Really a present-day prodigal situation. There's been years of distance, years of hurtful words. And now at holidays, this is the worst. When you miss them the most. And you can really identify with how the prodigal father felt. You did your best to raise him in the faith, but he's rejected it. You watch her slipping deeper and deeper into sin, increasing in bitterness, increasing in anger, increasing in a life of chaos. And you think getting out of this mess is highly unlikely. What is it going to cost to get out of this? Well, how many years of prison are probable? There's hurt that is way too deep for me to humanly forgive. Each time that a friend comes over, each time that a Christmas card comes that sing the praises of that family's children, it is like rubbing salt in a wound. You think, is there any way out? Still others of you maybe are in a profession where you just can't get ahead. It's a profession that you love. It's in a field that you love. You work hard and you aren't rewarded. You're innovative, but you see no returns. You take risks and yet they all fall flat. You can't find good employees. Or maybe your boss is too restrictive, too micromanaging. Making ends meet is paycheck to paycheck. You want to be generous. You want to support the gospel around the globe. You give, you tithe. You want to give your kids and grandkids gifts for Christmas, but you don't know how that's going to happen. You even stick to a budget. You haven't been down to the movies. You haven't been on a date in months, maybe years. You can't get ahead. There's no deep breath. Things keep piling up. And just when you think you get a deep breath, then the battery goes out in your car. Then something breaks in your house. And so I think here we can all identify with Abraham, can't we? I think as we get to a point here, we can understand where Abraham came from decades of knowing God's promises. And yet, each year becoming more and more unlikely. Living in faith plays out every day. But brothers and sisters, I want you to see something. That if our certainty in our faith, the certainty that God can do what he said he will do, that God is who he says he is not found in our circumstances. Because if it was, we would be on shaky ground. Our certainty is fixed to the character of God. Our certainty is fixed to his grace. Our certainty is fixed to his faithfulness. He has never failed yet. We believe the promiser, the one who made the promises. And so with this in mind, with understanding Abraham's life, with recognizing maybe our own situation, how we can identify, let's look now at verse 18 and see the aspects of Abraham's faith. As we come back to the initial questions of, well, what is faith? What makes faith faith? What are the aspects? Here we see it illustrated. Our righteousness is not found in the law, circumcision, or any other ritual, but our righteousness is found by faith. In verse 18, he gives us 4 aspects of our faith. In hope against hope is the first aspect. In hope against hope, he believed. And really this, when you think in hope against hope, what is that? That's an oxymoron, isn't it? He believed the unbelievable. That's a contradictory statement. That's like saying something is awfully good, or that the silence was deafening. Those are oxymorons. Those are contradictory statements. That he believed the unbelievable. But you see, this is one aspect of Abraham's faith. When there seemed to be no hope, when things were increasingly unlikely, he believed the promiser. He believed the one who made the promise, so that he might become a father of many nations, according to that which had been spoken. So shall your descendants be. He believed even in the years when that became more unlikely, more impossible, he believed the unbelievable. Because see, the first aspect here, that in hope against hope he believed, we might say that we believed the promiser when the promise seems impossible. That's the first aspect of faith. We believe the promiser when the promise seems impossible. Even when it seems to be contradictory, even when it seems unlikely, this is what makes faith. The second aspect then is really a negative statement said 2 different ways in verses 19 and 20. Without becoming weak in faith. And so we say, for the second aspect, that we believe the promiser without flinching. We believe the promiser without flinching. He says, without becoming weak in faith. And then jump down to verse 20. Yet with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief. See, a casual exam of Abraham and Sarah, we know that they are well past childbearing. We know, without becoming weak, he knew that we just know that he was dead, that Sarah's womb was dead, that it was beyond childbearing. They're 90 and 100 years old. That is impossible. And yet they did not flinch, flounder, collapse, or waver in their faith. They did not panic. They did not worry. They did not fret. And they did not doubt. There was no second guessing, and there was no reconsidering of what God said. You know, James talks of this person as the one who is tossed to and fro. That is the antithesis of the person of faith, right? Because the person who is not in faith, the doubting person, is the one who wavers. The doubting person is the one who does grow weak. But rather, Abraham did not, because our faith, an aspect of faith, is that we believe the promiser without flinching. This is what we do not do. We do not flinch. We do not cower. We do not flounder. We do not collapse to the ground. We do not doubt. We do not be wishy-washy. But rather we hold fast. We stand firm. We have resolve. Said a positive way. But the third aspect then, in verse 20, look here, he said, with respect to the promise of God, yet with respect to what God had said, and what God said would be true, that he would be the father of many nations, despite his present circumstances of having no children, and then having one in Isaac, he did not waver in unbelief, but what? But he grew strong in faith. And so if the previous was a negative statement, what we don't do, now this is what does happen. This is what we do. This is the positive statement. And yet this is not, this is a passive verb. Because the resistance here is what happens now to make him grow strong. Plants don't go strong in their own strength, but it's an outside force. And this exercise of faith is really like weightlifting. With the resistance, with oppositions, burdens, those burdens that we put upon ourselves, it causes our biceps to grow, right? As we do curls, as you think of lifting weights, the resistance of those heavy weights, maybe a 50-pounder if I'm real strong. But that resistance, that opposition, those burdens, what happens? That makes my biceps grow. And when those things are met and overcome, they grow with every curl. So too is faith. When temptation, ridicule, opposition is met, resisted, and overcome, our faith grows. This is what faith is, even when those things are in our face, even when ridicule, temptation, trial, opposition, when things are unlikely, when things are impossible, when it seems that there is no hope, and yet we stand firm in the promiser, then our faith grows. This is an aspect of this. This third aspect, we would say, we believe the promiser and give him glory. But he grew strong in faith, giving glory to God, verse 20 says. This is the aspect. This is what happens as we resist, as we do not waver, as we don't just look at the weights and give in, but we stand firm. Then is that we grow with that resistance in the face of opposition. This, beloved, is really a test of faith. Because this is one thing. We don't judge men's hearts. We can't say, oh, he's saved, she's saved. Oh, he's definitely not saved. That is for the Lord. But there is really two things in this world that we can really tell if somebody has been declared righteous with God. And that's based on their confession. Does their life model Christ? Do they speak it with their mouth? Do they live it out? Are they living a life marked of holiness? What a believer does do. And then their perseverance in trial and temptation. That when they're met with ridicule, when they're met with disease, when they're met with illness or death or something in their life, do they throw up their hands and give up, or do they stand strong? Is that a means of growth in their faith? And when we see that, brothers and sisters, that is the most genuine mark of faith that we can ever see in a person's life. You want to know how they stand up, then see how they stand to persecution, ridicule, opposition, trial, temptation, death. When the intruder comes, when things don't go their way, do they stand firm, or do they cower and flinch and hide away? Or do they stand and believe the promiser? Do they believe the one who made the promise? So we believe the promiser and give him glory. Can they say in the face of trial, "Blessed be the name of the Lord"? That, brothers and sisters, is a mark of true faith, seen in Abraham for decades and decades with the ridicule and the waiting that took place. And he believed God, stood firm. And why? Well, the fourth aspect in verse 21 now is said this way. We believe the promiser can and will fulfill his word. Look at verse 21. And being fully assured. He didn't waver, but he grew strong, and he grew in his assurance. This is a positive statement again. This is again a result of the resistance, is this increasing assurance, this growing strength in our certainty, this growing confidence, not arrogance, not pride, but a growing confidence in the promiser, a growing assurance that God had promised, and because he promised, because he said it, that he would and could do it. Because remember what was said way back in John 14, that Jesus, when he's leaving, he said, if it was not so, I would not have told you. And when God speaks, he doesn't just speak carelessly. He doesn't speak untruthfully. But if God says something, and especially if he promises something, he will and can fulfill it. It may not be according to what we think or the plan that we have, but if God promised to do it, then he was able. He possessed the power to do it, to bring it to pass. This is the nature of faith. This is what we saw in Abraham. Abraham knew that God could. He said that he would be the father of many nations, that he would have many descendants, that his descendants would be more numerable than the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, that he would have many descendants, and that God could make that happen, even despite that he was old, even despite all of the opposition. So we believe the promiser can and will fulfill his word. That's a mark of faith. That's an aspect of our faith. Do you believe that God can and will accomplish his purpose in your life? Do you believe that God can and will save you? That he will and can keep you? It's a mark of our faith. This is the assurance that comes. This is the confidence that comes with faith. It isn't just blind adherence. It isn't just baseless, wishful thinking. We are confident. It is reasonable. We know that God possesses the power to save and to keep us. And all of these things, what does he say then in verse 22? What's the result of these aspects of faith? What is the result? Well, therefore, faith was credited to him as righteousness. Coming back to that defining moment, coming back to the moment of his regeneration, of his justification, of his righteous standing before God, coming back to Genesis 15:6. This is the type of faith, not just wishful thinking, not just blind adherence, not just some playing the odds. This is a sure, confident, firm, unflinching, God-glorifying faith. Confidence in God. This is genuine faith. Wavering, doubting, which are elevated today amongst postmodern thought, well, how can we ever be sure? And this kind of wishy-washiness, they're elevated really as virtues of humility, of virtues of holiness and godliness. Well, I can't say anything certain or hold to that truth. Doctrine, things, dogmatics are not, we can't be certain about anything. Well, the Bible is here to say, well, that's not faith. Because we can be sure, we can be confident. Beloved, if you're beat up tonight, beloved, if you are wrestling, if it has been decades for you, rest assured. Stand firm in the promiser, the one who made the promise. The final 3 verses now of this chapter are really a summary of saving faith. Paul then just brings us back here. It's more concluding thoughts. He sums up all of these things of all of Abraham's life that we've seen. We've seen him, it's not through the law, it's not through circumcision, it's not through our obedience to the law, but it's rather by faith, in the kind of confident faith that Abraham displayed in his opposition. And so in verse 23, now he just transitions and says, well, this is why it was written. It wasn't just for his sake only, although that is a reason. There's really 3 reasons here of why this was written, of why it is this way, of this summary of saving faith. Well, it is for Abraham's faith. It was for his sake, because God was working out his salvation. God had his plan in Abraham's life, and so it was for his benefit because he's declared righteous. But also, verse 24, also for our sake. It's to teach us how God saves, right? And so here's really a great summary of justification by faith alone. And so it's to teach us how God saves, how he saves. To whom will be credited? Because he who was delivered over for our transgressions and was raised for our justification. That just speaks back to what justification by faith alone is, that we are pardoned from our sin and that we are also given Christ's perfection. We're declared right with God by faith alone. We have the faith in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus to accomplish both the pardon of our sin to Christ and the perfection of Christ to us. Really, verse 25 it sums up redemption. It's the abridged version of the gospel in verse 25. But it's also here. It's here for Abraham's faith. It's to teach us of how God saves, but it's also to teach us how to have faith. And so I would just close with this. Therefore, if you are the one whose spouse doesn't believe, if you're the parent of the prodigal, if you're the hardworking person who can't get ahead, and again, just fix your hope to Jesus. I'll just take us back even to what Chris preached the other week from 1 Peter. Our hope needs to be fixed to Jesus in this. And the more unlikely the situation, the more likely it is that God will show up. The harder the workout, the stronger that you get. Wimpy workouts don't get you anywhere. Don't let circumstances beat you down. When you're tempted, fall to your knees in prayer. If you find yourself in a situation like this, commit to fasting. Commit to pleading with God. Fast every Monday until God does something. Groan in prayer, like a workout groans. As you're grunting, as you're exerting energy in working out, exert your faith, groan in prayer. Believe that He can turn things around. Stop trying to fix everything, and which only complicates matters. It's not mentioned here, but if you look back at Abraham's life, along the way, Abraham and Sarah tried to fix the problem, and they just complicated matters with a woman named Hagar and a subsequent son named Ishmael. And that has kind of forever complicated the whole family relationship. You think you have a complicated family. Well, the Jewish people have a way complicated inter-family relationships now that has existed since they tried to take things into their own hands. You know what? If you find yourself into that situation, you may not know God's solution, but know that He has one, and that He can and that He will fulfill it. He will work out the solution. Keep at it. Don't give up. It might be decades before you ever see any results. It was for Abraham. So stay faithful. Believe the promiser. Believe the promiser in the integrity that He has, the faithfulness that He exhibits. He has never failed us yet. Amen? Amen. Amen. What a great chapter. What a great illustration. Excuse me. So as we close tonight, we're going to sing a familiar Christmas tune, O Come All Ye Faithful. It's number 145 in your hymnal. As we process this, as we think through this, as we commit to living faithful, let's stand now and sing this closing hymn, number 145, O Come All Ye Faithful.